Good evening, everyone. It's Kim from the Pennington Public Library. Thank you for joining us for a conversation with local author Laura Spence-Ash. If you have any questions during the program, please write them into the Q&A section, and I will share them with Laura throughout the program. You may also place all of your other comments in the chat window. Laura may read them as well in the chat window. Before we begin, let me provide a brief introduction to Laura Spence-Ash. As many of you may know, Laura's debut novel, Beyond That the Sea, was published by Celadon Books on March 21st, 2023. The novel received a starred review from Publishers Weekly, was named a GMA Buzz Pick, and is an Indie Next Pick for April 2023. Her short fiction has appeared in One Story New England Review, Crazyhorse, and elsewhere. Her critical essays and book reviews appear regularly in the Ploughshares blog. She received her MFA in fiction from Rutgers, Newark, and she lives locally in central New Jersey. Welcome, Laura. Thank you for joining us here at Pennington.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim. It's lovely to be here. Nice to do a local event.
I know, it's great. Laura, you and I were just chatting, and it seems that you have been traveling or maybe Zooming to many groups in the area and otherwise. How's that been for you?
It's been really fun. I love talking to people about the book. I mean, I enjoy talking to people who haven't read the book, but it's really fun to talk to a book club of people who've gotten to the end of the book and they really want to talk about it, and they want to talk about the characters and how things developed and how I wrote it. So that's been really, really fun to get out there and meet people and talk more in depth about the book.
Oh, that's great. This is your first book, is that correct? Your first full novel?
This is my first book. I'd published a number of short stories and quite a few critical essays and book reviews, but this is my first novel. I'm 63. I'll be 64 in about 6 weeks. So it feels amazing and wonderful. And I'm just feel so thrilled that I got to do this at this point in my life.
Wow. Can you tell us about how the process has been for you translating from your short story work or your other writing work into a longer format?
That's a great question. I love that. It actually was a real challenge. I'd started this book in about 2008, 2009, and really didn't feel equipped to write a novel. I really didn't feel like I knew enough and knew how to write a novel. And so that's when I went and got my MFA. I did that from 2014 to 2016. And then armed with the skills that I gained from that program, I've had a little more confidence. But even then, most MFA programs, including mine, focus on the short story because that's an easy thing to talk about and to teach and to kind of focus on in workshop. So even after doing that, I struggled with writing a novel because I didn't really know how to write something that was 300 pages instead of 20 pages. And I think one of the reasons that this book has very, very short chapters was that felt way more comfortable to me because I could write a chapter and feel like I had accomplished something and felt like the story was moving forward. And I wasn't worried about writing these great long chapters and trying to link them together and think more about plot. So, we'll see. Maybe my next book will look more traditional. I don't know. Now that I've written one novel, maybe I'll feel more comfortable to write the next.
Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting. I did notice that the format was very brief in the chapters, and also with the alternating characters. Was that something? Well, actually, let's just go back a little bit. Where did the story come from? What was the origin of this story, and how did this story come about?
So in 1998, which is 25 years ago, I read an article in the New York Times about a group of older British adults who came to the States to see where they had lived during the war. And I had no idea until I read that article that children have been sent so far afield. My children were young at the time. They were 1 and 5. And I couldn't imagine making that choice myself to put my children on a ship and send them across the Atlantic. And I was just fascinated. I wasn't really writing at the time, but I just read anything I could find. And it was when I actually read a memoir by a man who'd been sent with his brother to a town south of Boston, where it turned out completely coincidentally that he had been sent to the same town south of Boston where I went to high school. And in fact, he and I went to the same school. He was there as a day student because he was living with a family in town. And I went as a boarding school student. I grew up in northern New Jersey, but I went to high school at this boarding school south of Boston. That's both a boarding school and a day school. And that was when this book kind of opened up for me, because all of a sudden I had a setting. Like, I knew that place so well. It was a place, the first place I'd ever been away from my family was when I went away to high school. And so I knew what it felt like to be in that place and to be missing my family and be far away. And so obviously my experience is so different from the experience of Bea in the book or the experience of this man who'd been sent to Boston, but I just knew a little bit of something about how it felt to be in that place, and everything else kind of grew out of that.
Wow. What did the research process look like for you? The characters obviously have a lot of depth to them. So where do you go from finding out about this gentleman years ago and then developing a whole full-fledged story with characters around that?
Right. So I just love doing research. There's kind of nothing I love more than doing research. So I spent a lot of time doing a lot of reading around the Blitz and around children who were sent away. But I found over years and years that I just wasn't writing all that much because I was just spending an awful lot of time doing research. And when I finally sat down to write the book in this format, I really had only researched kind of the first 10 years of the book. And I just decided I had to stop doing research and I had to start writing the book. And I would kind of then do these deep dives. When I got to a certain point in time, I would kind of do a deep dive just to kind of ground myself and understand kind of what the world looked like at that moment in time. And then I would try and pull in whatever small details I felt were necessary to establish that. But I tried not to go overboard with the history, because I don't really, this is historical fiction, but I actually think of it more as literary fiction that happens to be set in the past, because I think the focus is, as you say, on the characters, not necessarily on the time period.
Yeah, yeah. Was that I guess it was a conscious decision for you. Did you get to a point where you had to decide that, or you knew from very early on that you wanted to be character driven?
I knew from very early on. I mean, that's really what I'm drawn to when I'm writing, is to learn more about these characters and to represent them well on the page. I mean, I love the fact that history kind of runs along behind, and so we are in this different time, but that's definitely not ever my focus. I'm really interested in the characters more than the time.
Okay. Okay. I think a lot of our audience who may have read parts of the book or read all of the book definitely would have noticed this about Beyond That the Sea. Very character driven. In fact, I think what really draws people into this book is the opening. And Laura has kindly agreed to read parts of her book during this interview. And I would love for you to read part of the opening, because it really, I think, paints the picture of Bea and her character.
Sure. So I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs. And so the book has 8 different point of view characters. And this is from Beatrix, who's the girl who's sent over from England. She's 11 years old when she's sent over. But this is from the prologue. So it's actually later in time. It's 1963 at the time of this prologue. But when she's talking about thinking back, she's thinking back to the 40s when she was sent over from London. Back then, Beatrix liked to sit next to Mr. G when he rowed them all to the mainland. She would watch the town come into focus, the buildings growing larger, the white steeple in relief against the bluest sky. This was in Maine, where the family went each summer, and it was during the war, although that was hard to remember when they were there. Mrs. G often wore a pink or yellow sundress, her pearls tight round her neck, and she squawked about getting wet as William and Gerald splashed each other with water. Mr. G would roll his eyes and half-heartedly tell the boys to stop, his glasses spotted with sea salt, his tanned arms moving the oars forward and back in a smooth rhythm. When they got close, he would hand Beatrix an oar, and they would row together to shore. Once a year, they ate at the small restaurant in town that was located at the end of the dock. They sat at the same table every year, a corner table with 5 seats facing the water. This way, Mrs. G said. They could all watch the sunset sky change over the island, their island, the sharp spikes of the evergreens set off by the pink and orange streaks before the trees lost their edges as the sky grew dark. Not once in the years that Beatrix was there did the weather on this night disappoint. She was struck whenever she saw the island from the mainland by how different it was when seen from afar. It was beautiful, a blurry patch of green caught up between the ocean and the sky. It was also so small that she could hold it in the palm of her hand. When they were on the island, though, she was the one who was small. It was her whole world. It was as though nowhere else existed. Thanks.
That's beautiful. It's very gorgeous. It really draws you in to Bee's world and her reminiscences. We have a question from Sandy. Sandy wonders if you started writing the book as part of the MFA program you were in, or did the MFA just give you the skills you needed to write this book?
So I had started writing it before the MFA, but very unsuccessfully, because I think I knew the story that I wanted to tell, but I couldn't quite figure out how to tell it. And as I said, the MFA really did focus on short stories. So I think I took a couple of chapters and sort of suited them up like a short story and workshopped them that way. But my focus really was on writing, as much as possible, writing new material and focusing on the short story. But I got a lot of confidence while I was there in my own skills and in sort of understanding more about the craft of writing. And I think that then helped me afterwards to really focus on this and to write it in the way that it is now.
Are you in touch with a lot of the people who are part of the program, and what part do they play in your writing?
I am. I had a wonderful, wonderful cohort. It's a great program at Rutgers, Newark, a fantastic faculty, including the writer Alice Elliott Dark, who wrote the novel Fellowship Point, among other novels, but Fellowship Point came out about a year ago, and it's just wonderful. And she was my thesis advisor, and I'm still in a lot of touch with her, and that's been so wonderful. I'm so thankful and lucky that she is in my life. And then in my cohort, it was just wonderful. I'm still in touch with a lot of the people. A lot of them are still in New York, so we see each other regularly. I always thought if I did an MFA, I would do one of these low residence MFAs where you basically stay in your life, in your job, and you just go to this program for 2 weeks out of each year. You're working throughout, but in terms of physically having to be someplace, you only do that 2 weeks out of a year, so you can just take vacation time from work. But when I applied to a number of low residency programs, and then I just kind of on a whim almost, I applied to Rutgers Newark, and I ended up getting a teaching fellowship there. So I was working at Princeton University at the time. I was able to leave my job, and I taught for the 2 years that I was in the MFA program at Rutgers. So it was wonderful. And what I'd always wondered about was in a full-time program, whether the cohort would be so much younger than myself that I would feel kind of not part of the group, but that didn't happen at all. They all were much younger, but it was wonderful. I have like all these wonderful young friends who are brilliant writers and will be writing for decades to come. And I love being part of that group.
Wow, that sounds great. I feel the same way when I went to library school. I met so many different people of all different ages. So you're never too old to get an education. So
exactly, that's right.
That's great.
Yeah, because you meet yourself. I'm sure you found it too. Like you meet through the work, right? It's not really about your age at all. It's about what you're there to learn.
Yeah, definitely. We have another question from one of our attendees. How did you come up with the title, Beyond That the Sea? And they also said they love the book. So
very nice, thank you. So it had many different titles over the years, and I actually did not title it this until right before we sent it out on submission, which is also actually when I wrote that prologue. I did not write that prologue until right before we went out to editors with the book. I knew for a long time I wanted to write the prologue because I wanted a prologue that would sort of speak to the book as a whole, kind of give you a sense of all the themes and a lot of the characters. So it didn't take me long to write it at all, but I'm so glad that I did, because I think it's a much
Yeah.
better beginning. But in terms of the title, I had thought about this title for a very long time, but I wasn't sure that anyone would sort of understand it or like it. I liked the fact that it had C in it. I liked that it comes from a Virginia Woolf quote, and I'm just going to read that. It's at the front of the book. But the quote is from The Waves, and the quote is, "In the beginning, there was the nursery with windows opening onto a garden, and beyond that, the sea." I love, love, love this quote, because to me, it's sort of the definition of a life, right? That in the beginning, you start in the nursery, you get to the windows, there's this unfurling that happens, right? The windows opening onto a garden, and beyond that, the sea. And one of the things that this book, I think, does for me at least, is that for all these characters, we do see this unfurling of each of these lives. We see each of these characters having a narrative arc that moves through time. And so I just love that this quote from Virginia Woolf is doing that, and that's what I felt that this book was doing as well. And as I said, I love the fact that sea was there too. And I think you've also, beyond that, the sea, there's such a sense of yearning and longing, and that too, I think, is something that's threaded throughout the book.
I definitely agree. I think you also, if I recall, you had used the phrase "beyond that, the sea" in one of your chapters, at the end of one of your chapters.
That's
Um,
right. But that happened like after I renamed it that, I went through and I sort of put that in there because I wanted it somewhere. Yeah, that's the great thing about editing, right? You can revise
yeah.
and go back later and like fill in those little holes that need to be filled in.
Yeah, it's funny because the attendee who asked that question, they said sometimes they had a hard time remembering the title. For me, the title just comes automatically. I don't know what it is. I've had being a librarian, I've had to remember many titles in my life, and there are many titles that do not roll off the tongue very easily. But for some reason, this title actually comes easily to me. So I don't know. Everyone's different.
That's great.
I guess. And the fact that B had to travel so far across the ocean. And
And you're
yeah,
right. As I said, the sea is so important because the sea is the thing that's in between these two families, right? That makes their relationship so difficult. Now it wouldn't be so difficult, right? We would just get on a plane and it wouldn't be that much of a distance. But then it was an enormous distance. And the sea was really the thing that kept the two families apart. And so that was really, really important to me, that be part of the cover and part of the image on the cover, et cetera.
hmm hmm last year, I think it was last year, maybe it was 2 years ago now, we had a community-wide big read in Pennington. And the book that was featured, The Best We Could Do, was about the immigration experience. And so, of course, when I read this, it really is about B, but her experience is an immigrant experience.
Right.
In your research, I guess, what did you come across in your research that allowed you to write this perspective, this immigrant experience of being, I guess, caught in two worlds, of leaving home?
Right. So, I mean, it was mostly, I think, a positive experience for most of the children that came, the ones that I saw. But certainly it was a difficult thing. And I think what was really fascinating to me was the thought that upon return, that was perhaps even more difficult, right? That you had this time apart, and now you were no longer the family that you had once been, and trying to, both for the child and the parent, to acclimate back to one another with that sort of hole in the middle of your relationship. And that to me was the most fascinating, was the return, as well as what it was like for her here during those 5 years. My only personal experience I have that's somewhat connected to this is both my children were adopted. So I have this I'm already very interested in families that are not traditionally formed, right? And so that, I think, underlies all of this, right? This is in large part, I think, a novel about family and how families are formed in so many different ways. And that has certainly been my personal experience. So I definitely was thinking about that as I was writing too.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that, because I did feel reading it, and I don't know to our audience if you felt the same way, but I felt it was so visceral and so real. this experience of being torn between two families, and then I guess the wealth of love from just having both families, but having to the struggles of that
Mhm.
as well. So yeah, yeah, it's beautiful. Holly has a question. Holly is wondering if you could talk about William's arc.
Sure. So William was probably the hardest character for me to write. I had a hard time kind of understanding him, I think, because I think he's someone who's just never, I mean, I think we know people like this perhaps that are sort of these golden children when they're a child and they have all this promise and possibility, and then it just never quite materializes for them, and that is a frustration for them. I think it was an enormous frustration for William that he couldn't ever achieve what he had originally thought he was going to achieve. And so I found myself frustrated with him that he was, that he sort of seemed to give up a little bit and sort of seemed to settle. He never seemed to be happy about anything. And so the first couple of drafts, I think, I was perhaps not as kind as a narrator towards him as I ultimately became to be, because for me, I need to really like all my characters. I need to understand them all to put them on the page. And so over time, I think I started to more clearly understand what it was like for him and how frustrated he was, and to feel his frustration at how would he change this, right? Like Rose became pregnant and he did what he thought was the right thing by marrying her, and at that time I think that's what you would have done, right? And he felt trapped, and I think maybe he was a little trapped. So it was both hard to write his arc and hard to write him, but it was also really fascinating to get to know him a little better and to develop empathy for him and to understand his frustrations.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think it's funny because I think we root for characters, we feel for characters, whether that be love or hate, or that's the interesting thing about going on this journey of reading a novel. And you sure put us through the paces with William. But it really showed that you thought deeply about where his life trajectory and where it was going.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. You have several other passages to share with us. Would you like to pick another one to share with us?
Sure. So I thought I'd read just a little bit from Nancy, and Nancy is the mother in America. And this is quite early in the novel, so it's actually on the first day of school, as you will hear. So B has been with them for just a couple of weeks at this point. On the first day of school, the sky blooms blue and wide. Nancy has made the children their lunch, packed into brown paper bags: hard-boiled eggs, tomato sandwiches, oatmeal raisin cookies. She takes their photo on the back porch before kissing William and Gerald on their foreheads and squeezing Beatrix on the shoulder. She knows she doesn't always like to be touched, but she can't help herself, and she wraps her arms around the girl's skinny body. Beatrix stiffens, but then Nancy feels, to her surprise, a kiss brush across her cheek. In the 2 weeks since Beatrix has been here, her face has filled out a bit, but her eyes still watch in fear. She's unfailingly polite, always responding to a question or inquiry, helping out in the kitchen, keeping her room tidy, although she is never the first to talk. But she laughs at Gerald's antics and seems comfortable around William. Nancy's proud of her boys, at the way in which they've taken to the girl. Have a good day, Beatrix says. Thank you for making my lunch. Nancy boxes Gerald on the arm. You could learn a thing or two from Beatrix's lovely manners, she says. Now off with you all. She's anxious for them to leave, but she knows she will spend the day, all day, waiting for them to return.
Oh. That sounds like it's written from some sort of inner experience of being a mother yourself.
Probably. I think a lot of us wait for our children to return, right? Especially on that first day.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned that William was one of the harder characters to write. How did you feel writing Nancy? And I know I've listened to some other interviews you've had, and I've talked to other people. I think there's nothing like a discussion about mothers in books that really brings about a lot of debate. A lot of people like to to, I don't know, talk about mothers, pit mothers against each other in novels. Poor mothers. We
Right.
women just we get the most scrutiny. We tell us a little more about your process writing both Nancy. First of all, writing Nancy, but then writing Millie as well. So
Right. So
yeah.
neither of them were really based on anyone I know. Like people have said to me, oh, is, Nancy like your mother and Millie like somebody else's? And they really weren't. They really were both just came out of my imagination. Nancy was definitely easier to write. Again, sort of like with William in the first couple of drafts, Nancy was much easier to write than Millie because Millie is a harder kind of character. And it was a sort of a similar trajectory for me as the writer. Like as I spent more time with Millie and got to know her a little better, I could empathize with her more. And I think consequently, she became a little softer around the edges. But it was really fun thinking about the two of them and kind of playing them off each other and thinking for Bea what it would be like to have these two such different mother role models in her life, and how that would kind of influence her as a both child, adult, and then ultimately when she became a mother herself. So it was really fun to think about that and to work on them, to think about those mother-daughter relationships also. What is that like when you have two such different people in your life as mothers? So yeah, it was a lot of fun to write those and to think that through.
I noticed in looking through your book, I think the second time around, I paid more attention to the actual years. But first of all, you have this lovely guide at the bottom of the book, which we'll get to in a moment. But the gap from when Bea from when I guess Bea returns, from when Bea leaves the States and then returns to England, and we see Bea again. I think it's like 10 years later. How did you come about that decision? Because there's that huge gap. What was your thought process behind that?
So I knew I wanted to do the years of the war. So that was 40 to 45. And then I'm a very symmetrical person. So I knew I wanted to jump forward in time. So I knew I would do 60 to 65 to kind of balance that off. And then I wanted something in the middle, and I didn't want it to be too, perfectly in the middle. So I just picked a date in the early 50s. And it was a challenge jumping that time and sort of filling it in so that readers wouldn't feel too lost about what had happened in the interim, but at the same time, not spending too much time filling it in because I just wanted to keep the story moving forward. I didn't want to do a lot of backstory in there. So it definitely was a challenge, but it was kind of a fun challenge because I knew right from the outset that I wanted to cover this great big swath of time. I'm really fascinated by what happens to people and characters over time. So I had to figure out a way to do that because there was no way I could kind of keep going kind of at the pace that the 40 to 45 section is, which is kind of jumping forward a few months usually in between each chapter. This book would be thousands and thousands of pages long if I did that. So I had to figure out a way, and this was what I decided. And as I say, it was a challenge, but it was also really fun to figure out how to do that and to not leave too many questions unanswered about what had happened in those gaps of time.
Yeah. I imagine it'd be challenging to figure that out. Could you tell us a little about your day-to-day, your writing process day to day? What's a day, a writing day look like for you?
Right. I try to write every day. I'm not always successful at that, but I try to at least do something. When I was writing this, so I took a year-long novel writing class at Catapult in New York, which sadly no longer has classes anymore. But there are many other year-long novel writing classes online and in person around the country. And that was when I really wrote the book in this format. When I started that class, which was, let me get my years right, the fall of 2018, I had about 30 pages written in this format with these very short chapters, knowing I was going to have 8 points of view. And by March of that year, I actually had gotten to the end. So because of the structure of that class, because there were 11 other people in the class, and we were all doing the same thing, because I knew they were waiting for pages, because I knew the instructor was waiting for pages. I actually set up a spreadsheet that told me how many pages I had to write per week to hit the markers when I knew I needed to hand in pages. And that was like the best thing ever, because I kept to that schedule. I did not let myself, like I scheduled it like even down to the day. I needed to write so many pages per day, Monday through Friday. And then I would give myself the weekend as kind of a buffer so I could catch up if I hadn't made it. But I made sure each week I did that number of pages so that I would be ready to start the next week. And that was it. I honestly don't think this book would be written if I hadn't taken that class and had that structure, because for me,
Wow.
so many other things, like for so many other people, I think I'm not atypical, that everything else in my life comes before my own writing, right? Certainly anything if I have an essay or a review, or I'm teaching a class, anything that I'm being paid for, that's going to get, that work is going to get done first before my own writing. So yeah, that's it. I definitely struggle with that, but I really try and write every single day, even if that only means writing a paragraph. At least I feel like I've been into that document and I've done something. I've looked at something, I've changed at least like a word or a sentence, or I've written a new one or something like that. Because I find if I take too much time away, I kind of forget where I am and I lose the kind of energy of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. You're not the first author who said that they've had to just set a schedule. I think I heard another author talk about how when he was younger, he used to have to set an alarm at 3 a.m. and write between his many jobs
Right.
that he
Right.
had just
Yeah.
just to get writing down. So yeah. When you wrote Beyond That the Sea, was it pretty, like you mentioned now that you wrote the prologue at the end, but was it pretty sequential for you, or did you write certain characters in order and
Yeah,
others in
no, I
other
wrote
orders?
it as you're reading, just linear, I just moved forward chronologically. And actually that the timeline that you mentioned, that I started doing during that year because I was losing track of where I was in time. So I did it for myself to remember, oh, is this like 1943 or is it 1944? But I just moved forward in time, and that was a great way to write this, because I think it had a lot of energy because of that, because I was just moving forward. And as I say, I really think time is kind of runs through everything here. So I think that for this book, that was probably the right way to write it.
Wow, wow. We have a question from Donald. The novel used a fusing of conversation between two people. Italics were used for speech. How did this come about?
So there are actually two different ways that dialogue is represented in the book. In the first part, which is the 40 to 45, and the third part, which is 60 to 65, those are written in the present tense. And the dialogue is embedded in it, and it's represented with italics. And I did that because for me, I wasn't thinking of these as chapters as I was writing them. I was actually thinking of them more as moments, just kind of moments in time that one day down the road would become a memory for whoever the point of view character was. And so I didn't want dialogue to sort of stand out the way it usually does on the page. Usually when we represent dialogue, we put in quotation marks. There's a lot of white space around it, right? We're pulling it out. We're using he said, she said throughout. And I just wanted dialogue to be one of those things that's in that moment, along with a lot of other sensory experiences. But in the middle part of the book, that is actually written in past tense, and it has a retrospective voice. It is these two characters that are just together for a couple of days, Bea and William. And in my thinking, this was the story that they told themselves for many years after about those 2 days that they spent together. And so I wanted it to be more traditional in its storytelling. And I thought they would actually remember these full lines of dialogue, right? They would remember sitting on a bench together and what they talked about and the exact words they used. That would have been really important to them. So that's why that section was constructed in that way. And the first and the third done very differently.
Wow. I have to go back and look at that. I know about the italics. I recognize that. I'm thinking, I must have missed that part about the 50s then. Okay. You see, this is why you need many readings. Oh my goodness.
And a lot of people notice the dialogue, I feel, but most people don't notice the past tense and the present tense. And that was really important to me, those differences, to really represent this in a different way. Yeah. And it was one of the things I was worried my editor was going to push back on, and she didn't at all. She was perfectly happy with it. So that was wonderful.
Wow. That was my next question. I was going to ask you, how was it working with your editor? And often I ask authors this because everyone has such a different experience with working with their editor.
Right. It was wonderful. My editor is Deb Futter, who's at Celadon. She is the publisher of Celadon as well as the top editor. So she's has a lot on her plate. But she has been doing this for her whole career. So she's really, really wonderful at it. And she didn't do a lot of editing kind of on the line, but she had some wonderful questions about the characters and about characters' arcs that helped me to shape them more clearly. She had some wonderful edits. We cut not a lot, but any major cuts that were made were in that third section. We just kind of slimmed that down a little bit. But she was just a joy to work with. And we didn't go back and forth. I mean, I think there was the first set of edits, and I turned that in maybe mid-January of, almost 2 years ago now. And maybe we went back and forth one more time after that. And then it went on to the copy editors, et cetera. But yeah, she's a joy, and I feel very lucky to have her as my editor.
That's wonderful. And she approved of your decision to have this change in tenses. So I have to look at the book again. That's what I have to do. Oh my goodness. But that's what book groups are great for, is sometimes one of us misses something, another person catches something.
That's right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Holly has another question for you. Who are some of the authors you would admire? She guesses that maybe Amor Towles is one of the authors you admire.
I have to admit, I have never read him. I'm very embarrassed to admit.
Oh, wow.
I know everyone keeps telling me I need to, but I have not read him. But so my favorite author is William Trevor, who was, for those of you who are not familiar, an Irish writer. He died a couple of years ago, but he was primarily a short story writer. He has, I don't know, hundreds of short stories probably. He also wrote very short novels, which are wonderful. Probably maybe my favorite novel of all time is one of his. It's a very short novel called Fortune's Fool. It's just lovely. He grew up in Ireland, then he lived in England for a long time. He actually moved back to Ireland towards the end of his life. I think his best short stories are the ones that take place in rural Ireland. They tend to be about small people living small lives, but he makes their lives so meaningful in the attention that he pays to it. And he's just a beautiful, beautiful writer. And along the lines of him would also be Claire Keegan, who's more of a contemporary. Her book, Small Things Like These, many of you may know. It came out about 2 years ago. She has a collection coming out, I think this week, maybe next week. She is just in a similar way. She tends to write about, rural people in Ireland, but infuses them with so much humanity and so much grace. And just a beautiful, beautiful writer. Her sentences are just stunning. That's why Elizabeth Strout is a big favorite. I love pretty much all of her books. Olive Kittredge is probably my favorite, but I think they're all wonderful. And then Ann Napolitano, whose book Hello Beautiful came out last spring, which is just wonderful. Her book before that was Dear Edward. So they're wonderful. And then I mentioned earlier Alice Elliott Dark and her novel Fellowship Point. Highly, highly, highly recommend that.
Wonderful. To add to everyone's to read list. I recently read Foster by Claire Keegan, which was beautiful. I kind of wished it was even longer. Like I wanted to know more.
Yeah, so I've heard her say that she thinks something needs to be as long as it needs to be. Foster actually started, it was a short story in the New Yorker in 2010.
Ah,
And then I think somebody sort of said what you just said, like they wanted this, but they wanted a little longer. So she actually published it in Ireland first as a novella. And then they just published that. I think she then edited a little, maybe added a little more for the American version.
okay.
But yeah, Foster, I think I love that too. And there's a wonderful movie based on Foster called The Quiet Girl, which is streaming now on Amazon if anyone wants to watch it. It's in Irish, which is wonderful. So you get subtitles in English, but to
Wow.
hear the Irish is really
Yeah.
something. And I think they really captured the essence of that book, which is so hard to do, I think. And I think they did a beautiful job doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of different formats, we have an attendee who wrote, I listened to the audiobook because of this webinar. I loved it and recommended it to friends. Could you provide any insight on the audiobook, whether or not you had any say on the audiobook narrator or any
Yes,
other information you
absolutely.
know?
So I had no expectations for this. I didn't think I was going to have a voice in this, but they actually sent me 3 tapes of 3 different British actresses or narrators reading excerpts from the book, doing both American voices and British voices, and asked me who I would choose. And so that was so much fun to listen to these 3 wonderful women reading parts of the book. It was just such a treat. And there was one she is actually more of an actress than a narrator, and her version was very energetic and had a lot of life to it. And I initially was leaning towards her because I think this is a quiet book. And I thought, well, maybe that would add a little oomph that it needs. But then I listened again to another one of the women, and their version was like somewhat familiar to me, the voice. And so I looked them up, and it turned out that they had read Hamnet. And I had listened to Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was kind of my solace. Like every night I would listen to a little more, and their voice was just so calming and soothing. And I just loved it. So when I realized this was the same narrator, I thought, okay, I think this is the right narrator for this book, because I love the way the tone really fit with the tone of the book. They read very, very slowly, and I think that's part of it. I think it really allows you to kind of sink into the words. She pays attention to each word. So I'm just thrilled that they narrated the book, because I think they did a beautiful job.
Yeah, I did listen to the book as well. And I do enjoy myself a good audiobook. And I think that you made a great choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Your book is very, I think the word, which you mentioned even with the title, but I think the sense of nostalgia comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Has anyone ever told you that? There's a lot of nostalgia in the book.
Yeah, they have told me that. And people have also talked about, somebody was just saying the other day at a book club I went to, there's emphasis on objects at a time when a lot of us maybe are sort of shedding objects. And I thought that was really interesting too, this idea that maybe things were more object-based 50 years ago or so, or 100 years, right? That there's been this shift. One of the fun things that I think about writing something that takes place in the past is it allows the reader, I think, to compare what happened then to what's happening now. And a lot of people have also talked about the letters and the chess as being, the movement of time is so different than the way we move through time, right? Then you would wait
Yeah.
for a letter for weeks, perhaps, right? Especially during the war. And now we email each other and DM each other, and it's instant, right? So that's always fascinating to me, portraying these lives in the past and thinking about how that compares to our lives today.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you read about people playing postal chess? Because I never heard of it before this
Oh,
book,
really?
actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So my son, when he was younger, played competitive chess, and he used to play postal chess with my husband's uncle. He lives in Massachusetts, and they used to, and
Oh.
he'll be 90 this fall, that man, and he actually still plays postal chess with a number of people around the world. So he's got a number of games going at all times, and he waits for I don't know now, maybe he does it via email, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I just always thought it was so wonderful. And so when I thought of it for the book, it just seemed to fit so perfectly, again, with this idea of how time moves and how differently we live our lives. And then I love the idea of having different people in both families over the course of the book end up playing chess with each other. It seemed a really nice way to communicate in that way that sometimes we communicate with people without really communicating, right? You're not really talking to each other, but you are communicating. So I thought that was kind of great.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in terms of the passage of time, you could really see the difference because I think you have Bea thinking back to when she first crossed the Atlantic when she was younger, and then years later flying via plane.
Right.
It's
How
quite,
easy it is, right? Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. I almost want to start playing postal chess, but I do so many things digitally now. Like you mentioned, like now,
Right.
just playing games online with your family, and to think
Right.
about the idea of, okay, I'll mail it to them.
Right. And then when I was doing research, I mean, I did some research just because I was trying to figure out what the cards would have looked like at that time.
Yeah.
And that's where when I discovered that they actually redacted or destroyed a number of the cards during the war because they thought that the chess notation was code. And that was fascinating to me. And so, of course,
Yeah.
I had to use that in a very small,
Yeah.
I mean, it's in there in a very small way, but that was a really fun detail. And that's the joy of doing research, right? Is when you find like these little details that kind of enrich everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of items being symbolic, I just think about the food in the book and what it represents, especially, I guess, Nancy's food that she makes. Um and I think you also meant, I guess there was also like the souvenirs or the gifts that are given too.
Right. The
Yeah.
food, I mean, for whatever reason, I love writing about food. I think it's really, and I think for Nancy, it's so much a part of who Nancy is, right? It's the way she shows love, right? Is to cook for everyone and to give
Yeah.
them food. I actually went to a book club last week and they'd had a cake made because it still is August. It was August last week. And that was 3 of the characters in the books have August birthdays. And that's in the prologue, it talks about how they would go out to dinner at that restaurant that I read about, and they would have this cake. And so this book group had a cake made that said, "Happy birthday, Bea, William, and Gerald." It was wonderful, just wonderful. Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it really was. It was lovely.
Oh. Talk about the symbolism.
Yeah,
August
right.
birthdays are great. I do know I have 2 important people in my life also have August birthdays. So yeah.
Yeah. So great. Yeah.
Okay. So Kristen has a question. Was there a physical location that you went to do your research, a particular library?
No, most of the research I did was, online or through books. I did visit when I was in London once. I did visit the War Museum there, and that was wonderful. They have some amazing
Oh,
exhibit
wow.
about kind of what domestic life was like during the Blitz, and that was incredible. In fact, there's sort of an apartment you can walk into, so you can see what it felt like to live in an apartment with the shades on the windows and the candles burning, et cetera, et cetera. And that was really wonderful to kind of viscerally understand what that would have been like. But most of the research I did, again, because I don't really think of myself as a historical fiction writer, I didn't sort of do those deep dives into research the way one of those writers would do, but I did enough so that the characters were firmly placed in time and place.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds fascinating, actually. So it's interesting to find these museums that show aspects of people's lives in the
Right,
past.
right.
Yeah. So I guess this is a more tough question, but what do you feel that you would have done differently if you were had to do this process over again with this book? Were there any things you would have changed?
Right. That's a really hard question. I don't think so. Like it was so long in becoming, right? In becoming a fully fledged book. What my editor said was, I think if I say I started around 2008 thinking about these characters and writing it in some form, she said, I think you were spending all those years just writing in your head. And then when you got to that time, when you had that class, you'd been writing in your head for so long. That's why it came out so quickly, because you'd been doing all that work all those years. And I think she's probably right. And I think her edits made it so much of a better book, much tighter. I don't think I would change much of anything. I mean, sentences, absolutely. Like every time I read something, I'm like, ah. And actually, when I did my launch, I read the whole prologue, and I edited out an entire paragraph. I just took it out when I read it. And so somebody asked the question of how did you know it was done? How do you know when it's done? And I said, well, it's never done, because I just like totally X'd out this paragraph. So yeah, that's, I'm very particular about my sentences, and that I would probably change forever, right? If I was allowed to, I would just keep changing, making them better.
Oh. Speaking of which, would you like to share another passage?
Sure. So I thought I would read from Millie, who's the other mother, the British mother. And this is just the first spring that Bea has been gone. So she's been gone almost a year at this point. There comes a day that spring when Millie empties Beatrix's closet. Everything must be too small by now, she figures, and it doesn't seem as if she'll be coming home soon. What was she thinking, keeping all these clothes? Her unspoken hope that she would be back before a year is up is dwindling by the day. She probably wouldn't want any of these clothes anyway. She's become so posh. A photo came a while back, taken at Christmas. Beatrix standing in front of an enormous tree decorated to the nines. The angel on the top of the tree touched the high ceiling. Real candles lit up the branches, with glass ornaments reflecting their light. Her hair was brushing her shoulders, curling up at the ends, and the bangs were gone, or at least held back by a headband. Millie didn't recognize the dress. It was so fancy, and she thought it seemed a little too grown up, a little too form-fitting through the net chest, the neckline dipping down. And what were those pearls? That's it.
Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
I think you capture the emotions so well with all of the characters and what they go through. I think it helps when you say you have to understand all of your characters, because I feel that they have a lot of depth to them.
Right. And I try to, these short chapters really enabled me to be as sort of minimal as possible. Like, I don't like a ton of interiority. I don't want to know everything that a character is thinking. I'd rather kind of feel it through one thing they're thinking about, and then maybe one thing they're doing, or a way they're seeing the world. That to me is more effective than kind of pages and pages of interiority. So I think that's where a lot of the emotional content kind of gets drawn, is in that, because it's so brief. And as I said before, these are just these moments that are sort of concentrated moments in time.
Yeah. In writing this book, what is it that you hope for the audience, the reader, to come away with, you think?
That's a great question. I mean, I do think it's a novel about family, and it's a novel about time. And in terms of family, I think it really is about this idea of that there's so many ways to create family, and we all have multiple families, and we're all pulled between those multiple families, right? And figuring out who we are, both in reflection of those families, but also who we are without those families by our side, is, I think, one of the major themes here. And then in terms of time, I think it's just the passing of time, right? I'm way more interested in a novel that tracks characters over time than I am in something that's very plot driven, that feels kind of contrived or overly dramatic. Like I'm very interested, as I mentioned, those writers that I really love, like William Trevor and Claire Keegan, I'm really interested in, just people living their lives, but the humanity within those people, that everyone's life is worth exploring on the page.
That's beautiful. And I think that that comes across in Beyond That the Sea. So
Great, wonderful.
thank you so much, Laura. I guess, of course, the final question being from Joyce. What's next for you? What are you working on now? What can we expect? Maybe after you answer all of these questions from these book groups and talk to all of us.
So I have not been spending as much time with it as I would like, but I hope this fall to return a bit more, and that I am working on something that actually grew out of a couple of short stories that I wrote while I was in my MFA. And it's 3 different women that live at different times in the 20th century, but their lives are connected. And it's really looking at sort of women's lives in the 20th century, how they changed, also how they didn't change. Again, sort of themes from this as well, sort of relationship between mother and daughter is definitely there. Thinking about class, which also is an element of this book. These women live in different classes. But it's really been fun because these are characters that I loved in these short stories, and now I get to spend so much more time with them and kind of develop them, and they're really kind of blooming in front of me, and that's really, really fun. And it's really fun to juxtapose their stories against each other because their lives are so different, and so much comes about just in the mere fact of juxtaposing their lives. So it's really fun to work on, and hopefully this fall I will get to work on it some more.
All right. That sounds very interesting. Please keep us posted. We definitely want to know.
I will.
How things are going. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Laura, thank you again for joining us. If you have any further questions for Laura, feel free to send me an email. I can pass them along to you, right, Laura?
Of course, yeah.
And I am looking forward to, number one, I guess next week, Laura, you'll be stopping by our book group just really briefly.
Right.
But I'm looking forward to that discussion with our book group at the Pennington Public Library. And I'm also looking forward to anything else you may write for us, Laura. So okay. Thank you again. All right.
Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.